This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, AEW was certainly at the top of the headlines this week. Funny enough, it has nothing to do with any of the backstage drama this time. No, it's actually stuff related to the on-screen product for a change. Moreover, good news related to the on-screen product. Ain't that a beautiful thing? Yeah, apparently that Wrestle Dream card wasn't all for naught. They actually got something of value out of it in the last 5 minutes. I don't know about the previous 3 hours and 55 minutes prior to that. But they definitely got people talking about the Adam Copeland debut. They missed their golden opportunity to bring in Tony Chimmel to guest announce the ring intro, though. Although that wouldn't have worked because it was a surprise debut. It's certainly a pretty big signing. Arguably one of the bigger signings AEW's ever had for their company. Not named CM Punk. Maybe you throw in a Chris Jericho or a Bryan Danielson if you're talking about tippy-top guys on the card. You know, guys that the mainstream would even know about. And obviously they couldn't use the Edge name in AEW. That was out of the question. I'm surprised Tony actually bought the rights to use his Alter Bridge theme from WWE. I guess that would pass the legal sniff test. I don't really know all that goes into using copyrighted music from actual bands. I mean, if WWE didn't buy the rights to permanently own that part of Edge's gimmick, then I guess AEW has the legal means of using it on their show. Public domain. Like I said, it's a pretty big signing. I don't know if it's enough to get me to want to watch AEW on a full-time basis again. You know, especially at least from the clips I've seen of him. Looks like he's potentially going to be feuding with Christian and the Dinosaur. I mean, I've seen the WWF version of Christian versus Edge before, and I don't think it worked even back then. Granted, these guys are older and more experienced ring veterans now, so in the land of AEW, it would probably wind up being their match of the year by default. But I just never really bought the Edge-Christian feud. Kind of like how I never bought the Matt-Jeff feud in WWF. Sometimes the dynamics work, sometimes they don't. You know, where you take established tag teams, split them off, and have them feud with each other. With Edge and Christian, I always liked it better when they were either a tag team together or they were off doing their own things in separate singles runs. I never liked them actually wrestling each other. It was just something about the pairing that didn't work for me. But it does leave me curious to see what they're actually going to do with him in the long term. He's what, 49 now? I mean, realistically speaking, he's only got maybe a few peak years left in his career to get the most mileage out of his work. The last match I saw him wrestle, funny enough, on SmackDown like a month ago, wasn't it against Sheamus? And I vaguely remember that match. I remember talking about it. I think I said it was good. Definitely not anything blow away. And I always kept that thought in the back of my head that maybe they were saving something for a later date. Turns out that wasn't the case at all. Maybe Edge will be a little more motivated in AEW than he was in WWE. Hard to tell. And the problem's always going to be, who do you feud him with that'll actually be of net benefit for Edge, the company, and the person he's actually doing business with? There are a lot of parties to take into account there. The issue with Edge is that because you don't really know what his future holds, given his age, how his body is capable of holding up at this point, what do you do? Do you rush into doing every possible dream match you can where it might serve its purpose to get the initial wow reaction? Or do you actually try to have him conduct proper business and feud with the younger guys on the roster, help establish them, give them a rub, and then actually try to develop the younger, greener talents? Ideally, that's what Edge's role should be. And I don't mean that to come off in a condescending way, but this is always the issue people bring up when you talk about bringing in big names from other companies. Established ring veterans that have done it all and don't really need to be pounded over. Yes, you obviously want to establish that they're big players. You want to have Edge rack up some wins. You want to book and treat him like a major star. But in the case that he ever does wind up feuding with guys like Ricky Starks or Miro or Powerhouse Hobbs, God forbid MJF, there's a big potential money match for you. But how do you go about those programs? What's the end goal? I mean, in the short term, yeah, you absolutely want to give Edge some squash wins. I think it's interesting how they're immediately trying to plug him into a feud with Christian and Luchasaurus when I think the Dinosaur is still the actual TNT champion. I haven't watched in a while, so maybe something changed, but I always forget about that dynamic because I think it was Luchasaurus that originally won the belt on the first Collision show, but Christian's been carrying it around because he's a douche nozzle, so it's hard to tell. But okay, there's an example where maybe you have Edge beat Luchasaurus and win the TNT title. Now you have something to work with. You can start letting him issue open challenges and try to get the most out of however long he has left. However long he thinks he can go, reasonably. And then whoever he does decide to drop the strap to, that's the guy you sort of establish as the force to be reckoned with. Again, this is all hypothetical. I just don't want to see this turn into a situation where you're having Edge run over everybody on the roster and it's not really doing much to establish the younger names. I mean, I was already kind of salty about the fact that Edge never really put over or did a proper job on his way out of the door with WWE. I still think there were younger guys there that could have benefited from that rub. Be it a guy like an Austin Theory or a Solo Sikoa. Maybe even a Gunther. I know Gunther's not young in the traditional sense of the word, but the fact that Edge's last match in WWE was a total throwaway TV match on SmackDown with Sheamus with like 1 week's build. I mean, yeah, I get it. It was his hometown, but still, I didn't really like how there was never any follow-up after that. He just sort of vanished during his contract renegotiations and never really passed the torch to anybody on his way out. Now, maybe that's the old school person in me talking, but that's my opinion. But like I said, it's a good signing for Tony Khan, good signing for the company. If Edge is going to be the Punk replacement for the time being, maybe that'll reinvigorate some life into their main event scene. Because they need it. They need it bad. And when you're talking about well-rounded talents, the 5-tool players that have everything in the book you could want, Edge is the guy. He's a great talker, great worker, great personality. He has presence. You know, at this stage, he's not a spring chicken in the ring anymore. But as long as he can still go, more power to him. Milk that pussy dry for all it's worth. Meanwhile, I'll be over here milking some classic wrestling dry for all it's worth. How's that for a terrible transition? By the way, I'm expecting a plumber to come in at some point, so if you hear some loud, obnoxious noises in the background, just try to tune that out. We're dealing with some shower maintenance issues right now. But it is the Friday show on the FSWR podcast, which means it's time for our weekly installment of NWA, Mid-South, and world-class reviews. And of course, make sure y'all subscribe, comment, like the show before we get started. Help me out in the algorithms a bit here. I appreciate the support where I can get it. Make sure you stop back on Mondays and Fridays every week to check out the new content. And guess we're good to get into things. There were a few things of note with all three shows, but I would say things were pretty tame across the board, with the exception of the last 5 minutes of World Class, which we will talk about at the very end in Seg 3. But let's go ahead and start with Crockett first. And I'll definitely be the first to say, this was almost an entirely skippable show. It was 48 minutes in runtime, and there were basically two things of note on the entire program, at least in terms of story advancement. Ronnie Garvin becoming the new NWA World Heavyweight Champion, which we already covered on last week's show when they aired the final minute of the match from the Joe Louis Arena. And we also had a World Tag Title change. Tully and Arn defeated the Rock and Roll Express. And that video footage they promised would be aired next week. It's funny, too. While David and Tony are explaining the whole situation regarding the World Tag Belts, David Crockett informs us that Ricky Morton suffered a shoulder separation and a concussion in that match, which is not the funny part. All you sick, twisted fucks out there. No. What's funny is they're explaining the Ricky Morton injury. Obviously, it's a heavy situation, one that you would think would require some solemn demeanor. So about 3 seconds after delivering that news, Tony and David are immediately plugging Starrcade 87, peachy as clams. Hey, Tony, Starrcade's coming up. What a great show we have in store. Damn shame about that Ricky Morton head injury, but Starrcade, Tony! Starrcade! The show must go on, I guess. David Crockett never ceases to amaze me. And this show indeed went on. Boy, did it ever. David was really clamoring for some hard-hitting action to kick things off this week. Very fitting that we begin with a Road Warrior squash against Clement Fields and Ed Franks. Been a while since we've seen Hawk and Animal on the show. I guess their touring in Japan was done by this point. And they didn't miss a beat steamrolling over some job guys here in the most raw, jerky manner imaginable. There was one thing of note in this 20-second squash. The very first spot where Hawk grabs Ed Franks and tries to deadlift him into a press slam. And at first, Ed Franks did not want to go up for this move. You could clearly tell. But as is the case with most Road Warrior squashes, Hawk looked at him and said, "Motherfucker, you're going up whether you want to or not." So while Franks was trying to desperately sandbag Hawk at every turn, Hawk used every ounce of strength to hoist this man overhead and slam him to earth. And he pulled it off. The only other human being alive that could do this, aside from Hawk, was Animal. So Ed Franks picked the wrong set of guys to try to not cooperate with. Boy, did he pay for it. And after they won, they do a ringside promo with Tony Schiavone. And it's been a while since we've heard Hawk cut a promo on this show, but if I were to tell you that his promo consisted of referring to the Four Horsemen as, and I quote, clamheads, unquote, would you be all that surprised? While at the same time referring to him and Animal as, again I quote, Neo-Mexi Zoom Dweebies. Again, I ask the question, are you at all surprised to hear those words come out of Hawk's mouth? I sure wasn't. For the record, I have no idea what either of those mean. No, I did not bother researching Neo-Mexi Zoom Dweebies. It is probably an actual insult. If that's what they were calling illegal aliens back in 1987, I'm glad that term became outdated. In any case, there was a point to this promo. By happenstance, you think I'm just totally fucking around right now. Now, the Road Warriors have a lot of open contracts sitting on Jim Crockett's desk at the moment, but they're picking their spot for Starrcade. They want Tully and Arn for the World Tag Team Championships. And right before they walked off, I believe Hawk's quote was, "We snack on danger and we dine on death." Okay, now that was a good line. I don't know about Neo-Mexi Zoom Dweebies. That one might not get over. But snacking on danger and dining on death? Now that sounds like something you could sell on a t-shirt. Speaking of things to sell on t-shirts, they were trying to come up with a theme for Starrcade 87. We come back from break, and we go to the production truck where Tony is sitting down with Jim Crockett, and they're running down the themes and the gimmicks of Starrcade from the previous years, dating all the way back to 83. Flair for the gold. In the following year, the $1 Million Challenge. Of course, in 85, we remember the Gathering. And up to last year, in 1986, the Night of the Skywalkers. Obviously paying tribute to the scaffold match. So as Tony's milking Jim's response, what will be the theme for Starrcade 87 this year, Mr. Crockett? Jim looks at Tony with that classic Jim Crockett blank expression, and he goes, "This year is going to be Chi-Town Heat." As he slowly turns his head back to the camera without blinking. And Tony pauses, and he goes, "Well, all right then, folks. You heard it here first." Okay, serious question. Pause the show. Are we sure Jim Crockett was not a fucking robot? I've seen some mechanical robots in my days. Let me assure you, AI has more inflection than Jim Crockett did. God love him. Tony Khan is easier to watch on camera. But yeah, that was a Starrcade update. They announced a theme. Why Chi-Town Heat? Because Chicago. That is all. That is the entire explanation. Glad they slept on that for a night or two. At which point, we go back to the ring for Terry Taylor versus Terry Jones in a UWF TV title match. And of course, because I'm a smartass, the first thing I wrote down was, really? You couldn't find any other geek for Taylor to squash here. You just had to pin him up against the other guy who happened to be named Terry. That bugged me. I don't even know why. But this is amazing. Poor Taylor's out there the whole time trying to be this pompous heel. It's totally not working. He's out there choking the guy, gouging his eyes, no-selling everything in the book. 99% of the studio crowd is going, "Come on, Taylor, let's go." I think there was one woman in the crowd that chanted, "Go home, Terry." And I'm sure that was directed towards Terry Taylor, but, well, you never know. Maybe she had some heat with Terry Jones for whatever reason. But yeah, heel Terry Taylor in 1987. Not happening. At least not in Crockett Promotions with the studio crowd. I mean, he's out there trying to work the crowd and get under their skin by targeting Terry Jones's leg. Every time he would drop an elbow on Jones, the crowd would all chant, "Yeah!" I laughed. All the camera shots to show the girls in the crowd. Hilarious, by the way. They were either totally bored watching or just smiling for the camera. One way or another, they totally did not give a fuck. And finally, Taylor won with the figure four, which the crowd popped for, by the way. And then we cut back to the booth for our first interview with the new NWA World Heavyweight Champion, Ron Garvin. He's got the gold, and he's here to let us know that he's going to be a defending champion. He's going to defend the belt across the world against the top talent in the sport for approximately 2 months before he drops the belt back to Flair at Starrcade, but we'll omit that part of the conversation for the time being. There really wasn't much to it beyond that. I did sort of cock my head sideways at his comment, "Ric Flair, you're entitled to a rematch, but it'll be on my time." It's like, huh. Teasing that heel turn rather soon, aren't we, Ronnie? All kidding aside, no, it was a fine babyface promo. Again, it just all goes back to that conversation we had the previous week. The fact that people kind of saw through the Ron Garvin title switch. And while the moment itself was a huge deal at the time, when you realize the actual title reign was a complete afterthought, kind of sucks. He was basically a placeholder champion for like 2 months. It's going to be one of those things where once we see Flair back on the show with the title again, we're going to have to reflect back on this moment and realize, oh yeah, that's right. There was that brief window where Ron Garvin held the belt on TV for like, what, 5 weeks? Then we had Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard versus Mike Force and Tommy Angel. And what was probably one of the rarer moments on the Superstation where the fans were actually less pro-horsemen than normal. We had some passionate rock and roll chants going on during this match. Apparently that Ricky Morton news hit hard for a lot of people. Didn't stop the Horsemen from doing their thing, though. Tully in particular was on a whole different planet in this match. Just outstandingly awesome. I mean, I always should figure, when we get the signature Tully strut, we're usually in for a good time. He's out there just having a ball, beating on these two jabronis. I did note early on, Tully went to give Arn the double high five spot on the apron. This did not apparently count as a legal tag. Meanwhile, on NXT the other week, Santino giving Emma a high five on the ring apron did apparently count as a legal tag. Difference in business philosophy, I guess. So while Tully and Arn are dissecting these guys, I'm continually reminded of why tag team wrestling will never be this great again. I mean, the closest tag team we have to a Tully and Arn in 2023 is FTR. And as much as I love Dax and Cash, and they rarely get opportunities to work squash matches on TV anymore. Plus, they're baby faces now, so it kind of kills the steam. I love watching Tully put Angel in a chin lock, while at the same time he's spitting in Mike Force on the ring apron, telling him to do something. And after Tully dumped Angel out to the floor, he went over and started pie-facing Force on the apron. Probably because he legitimately refused to get in the ring. And Tully got pissed at him. I wouldn't put it past him. And eventually, after Arn tagged in and did a few moves on Force, Tully tagged back in, gave him a slingshot for the 3 count. Probably called that one on the fly. He said, "Let me have this dumb motherfucker." Which again is a total Tully thing to do. But of course, those guys are on top of the world right now. The new NWA World Tag Team Champions. Which was the perfect segue into the JJ Luger promo afterwards, where JJ's talking about how just when people tried to spell doom and gloom for the Horsemen, they climbed right back on the train and took possession of more gold. You know, Luger's putting over the Horsemen credentials, giving Ronnie credit where it's due, because he may have gotten lucky against Flair one time, but Flair's been all over the world beating the best in the sport for years, and he'll have his chance at redemption soon enough. Yep. One line about that. About 5 weeks from now. And Luger touched on a few other things here. I wasn't methodically taking notes on it. He did another one of those Dusty's using the illegal chokehold promos, which is like every Luger promo on Dusty we've heard in the last 8 weeks. And when we come back from break, we pitch back to the ring for Lex Luger versus Mac McGiver. What a name. Mac McGiver. What was Mac giving in this segment? Aside from a crummy match? Not much. It's always a highlight when Luger makes sure to pause the action so he can flex at the camera. In this case, it's great because it was as simple as him telling Mac to stop so he could then turn to the floor cam and flex his biceps. And Mac was okay with this. He just totally stopped wrestling. They did like one collar and elbow tie-up, and then Luger yelled, "Stop," and Mac just stopped. He halted in his tracks, so Luger could admire his genetics. At which point, they do some more stuff for a while until Luger scooped up Mac and won with a bear hug. Didn't even break out the torture rack for this one. And in fact, he explicitly said, "I don't need the rack." It was funny because as soon as the bell rang, you could hear David Crockett grunt under his breath. Probably thinking to himself, "God damn it. I wanted to see the rack on this show, but he didn't give it to me." I did laugh too at the spot where Luger tried to throw Mac out to the floor, and Mac somehow managed to get his face tangled up in between the second and the third rope. I don't even know how it happened, but he looked like a total fish out of water trying to fall out to the floor. It was quite the task. Anyhow, well, then we had a Dusty promo after the break. And this is one of the best Dusty monologues where he's out there for like 4 minutes just rattling off stuff. And by the time it's over, I look back at my document page and realize I didn't write a single thing down about anything he said. I just totally spaced out. I don't even know how. I remember he put over Ron Garvin. The fact that he's the man now because he beat Ric Flair to become the World Heavyweight Champion. Of course, he still had to remind us that he also beat Flair for the world title twice. He also added somewhere in there that Ronnie needs to stay on his game, to not take his eye off the ball, because guys like Dusty are still gunning to become the World Heavyweight Champion. And that was one of those things where it was probably a total throwaway line in Dusty's mind. But again, you think about where things go in '88 with Ronnie Garvin. That line right there, that one probably stuck with him. He probably heard that and registered, man, this fucking Dusty Rhodes. Always trying to hog the spotlight and make it about himself. This fucking fat tub of goo. Can't even put me over without putting himself over first. See, it was a long-term game plan. A long-term game plan that had no proper payoff, but... well, we'll talk about it. Of course, I'm being somewhat facetious there. But then again, from a kayfabe standpoint, you could see why this might rub Ronnie the wrong way. All that work he put in for the last 18 months to finally beat Flair and become the new world champion. And here's Dusty on live cable television saying, Ronnie, you beat Flair. Good for you. I also beat Ric Flair. Twice, baby. It's like, fuck, dude. Could you throw Ronnie under the bus anymore? Could you make him look any more inferior? Man, the older I get, the more I start to understand why so many people loathe Dusty by this point. So then we go back to the ring for Ivan Koloff and the Warlord versus Keith Steinborn and Bob Riddle. Yes, Bob Riddle, the long-distance cousin of Matthew Riddle. I'm assuming most people would take that as a joke. I have no evidence to confirm that Matt Riddle had a distant family relative named Bob, who just so happened to be doing jobs on Crockett TV in 1987. Not saying it's implausible. I just don't think it's likely. With that said, Bob Riddle was the prototypical job guy. Aside from the abhorrent-looking ring gear, which consisted of a white singlet and zebra-printed leggings, he also had a horrible bleach blonde mullet. And in the span of the 1 minute he spent in the ring with Ivan, he nearly crippled himself trying to bump for a spinning neckbreaker. I don't know how Ivan didn't kill him. And in fact, it was so bad, Keith fucking Steinborn had to tag in to save the day. Keith Steinborn, the second worst local job guy in Crockett Promotions at this point. He looked at Bob Riddle and said, fuck, this guy sucks. I need to tag in and try to save this thing. Unbelievable. I mean, to be fair, the match wasn't long enough to be totally hideous. But when Bob Riddle was in there for that short window, he was like cable access bad. Warlord won with a running power slam. The only other thing of note here was Paul Jones geeking out for the mighty Wilbur. He says that'll be the full completion of his army once the mighty Wilbur shows up. I'll bet. But then came the actual highlight of the program this week. Ric Flair. Yeah, hold on. Let me write that one down. Ric Flair. Highlight of show. Cool. Now that we've established that, seriously, this is such a great Ric Flair promo. It is the first time in over a year that we have seen Ric Flair without the gold. And boy, does he look naked. Even in that custom $5,000 suit. Tells Tony that he's not there to look back at the past. He's here to look toward the future. And when it comes to Ron Garvin beating Ric Flair for the world title, that is a matter of fact that Flair has to deal with. He can't live in the past. But the thing is, when it comes to being world champion, something Ric Flair knows all about because he's done it 4 times, the buck doesn't stop with simply beating the previous champ. Because now, Garvin has to carry the torch. He has to defend that belt night in and night out. Whether it's in Australia, Greensboro, doesn't matter where the venue is, what country, what city, he's got to have eyes in the back of his head 24/7. He's got to be on pins and needles, wondering when the next guy's going to be waiting around to strike. Could be anyone. Could be the Road Warriors. Could be Dusty. Could be Nikita. Could be any and all combination of the Horsemen breathing down Ronnie's neck. They're going to be long nights. And as for Flair, just because he doesn't have the gold right now, doesn't mean he's going to lose his edge. He still knows how to party and drink and have a good night with the girls. And that is exactly what he's going to do as he looks to get back on his quest to become the World Heavyweight Champion for a 5th time. I believe his final statement, and I wrote this down specifically because it was so crazy at first, I actually needed to convince myself that this was something Ric Flair said. And think about that. Something that was so crazy that I could not believe that Ric Flair actually said it. First, he promised that he would not be the only hen in J.J. Dillon's hen house not producing eggs. And secondly, he's still going to kiss the girls and make them cry. So in other words, translation, he's going to have wild monkey sex and still be the nature boy. Glad to know nothing's changed. Whether he has the gold, whether he doesn't have the gold, Ric Flair is going to fuck. That was the message I got. And there's no one like him. Ric Flair was one of a kind. Truly. So, well, they did have another 6 minutes of airtime to kill. So, coming back from break, there was a brief Terry Taylor promo where he's calling out Nikita Koloff for not accepting Terry's UWF TV title challenge. Keeps implying that Nikita's hiding behind Jim Crockett and contracts to avoid getting in the ring with him. But he decided to stick around to scout Nikita's match with El Negro. This is also where I kept thinking I was having a seizure because, God, there was some wonky stuff happening with the studio lighting in this match. Was I imagining things, or was the room getting darker? I know I'm speaking right now as if everybody has actually watched the show with me, but I mean, if you have the Peacock subscription or you can find a clip of this somewhere on YouTube, go find the match. I mean, I know sometimes my phone will go into energy save mode and like the screen will naturally go darker at certain points in the day. I'm convinced I don't think it was a phone glitch. I think they were having some technical malfunctions here at the studio. No, in any case, Nikita won with the sickle in literal seconds, which then immediately led to Nikita calling out Terry to fight him. And, well, Terry answered. He got into the ring, and both guys immediately started getting into a wild brawl. And as Nikita goes to set up Terry for the sickle, and this is one of those things where, you know, you're watching the babyface try to set up the heel for something, and it's so obvious that somebody missed their cue, because Nikita's standing there teasing his sickle for like an hour, to the point where even Terry's looking up like, where in the fuck is Eddie Gilbert? And he's winding up that arm. He's in prone position. And he's standing there. And he's standing there. Time passes. And finally about a month goes by. And here comes Eddie Gilbert from behind to attack Nikita. And him and Terry put the boots to him. And they eventually lay him out with a double suplex. At which point, Eddie and Terry walk off with possession of Nikita's TV belt, claiming that they are the world's television champions. And as they walk off behind the curtain, Nikita finally comes to in the ring. He stammers over to the podium to ask what happened. And as Tony informs him that the heels stole his belt, boy, is that news that Nikita did not want to hear. He gets fired up. And he's screaming, "Where'd they go? Tony, where'd they go?" As the final image we see on the show is Nikita flipping over the interview desk. Tony Schiavone literally standing there, probably legitimately fearing for his life. Pee probably streaming down his leg. And, oh yeah. Suffice it to say, Nikita was pissed. Some tells me Terry and Eddie are going to regret that move. And thus begins another one of my biggest pet peeve storylines in professional wrestling. Stolen possession of titles from the actual champions, and management refusing to do anything about it. Where the heels can just walk around claiming to be the champions, no one ever says or does anything. The champions bitch and moan that they want their belts back. Management never bothers to step in. So we'll see if anything changes. Like I said at the top, though, I mean, this was almost an entirely skippable program. There were a couple okay promos here. A really good Ric Flair promo. A couple of decent squashes to keep the show mildly interesting, but I mean, you could probably call this a filler episode. We're still several weeks out from Starrcade, so we'll eventually see the card come together over the next few episodes, but so far they're doing a relatively decent job building up excitement. When Jim Crockett's the front runner to sell the card, it's not a good sign if you're looking for excitement, but, well, you kind of get my drift. All right, so we're cruising along in the Mid-South Review series as things are starting to heat up this week with the arrival of the Ugandan giant, Kamala. And we also have a featured bout on this week's program with General Skandar Akbar and Buck Robley, the special challenge match. Pretty simple formula for the card. And of course, here to call the action is Cowboy Bill Watts. And directly taken from my notes here, whatever in the fuck Boyd Pierce's suit design was supposed to be. Looked like God's bowel movement after a bad trip at Taco Bell. You know how I always talk about how men should never wear brown suits? Because it usually doesn't equate to a good color scheme. Well, Boyd Pierce demonstrated exactly why I'd make that my talking point. This was as close to shit-stained brown as you could possibly get. And God love him for it. He had more balls than most people to wear something like that in public. Anyway, we'll run down everything in sequential order like we always do. Started off this week with a quick JYD versus Nick Bockwinkel highlight reel from the City Auditorium in Houston, Texas. The catch here being Junkyard Dog is picking up steam in just about every town in the Mid-South region, quickly becoming a fan favorite. And boy, Watts wasn't kidding. JYD was the heart and soul of Mid-South for, well, pretty much his abrupt departure in '84, which I think most people are well aware of. I mean, if not, just keep following along in the review series because it's a tragic tale that warrants a lot of deeper explanation, especially when you look at his physical state right before he left. Boyd in particular chalked this one up to an outstanding match by the time we saw the full clip. I can assure you, after watching it in full, it was anything but outstanding. In fact, it was quite terrible for the 5 or so minutes it went. And they dubbed in Bill Watts' commentary after it was taped, obviously factoring in it was a house show when it originally aired, so there wasn't going to be any live commentary in the building. And, it was a JYD match. In just about every sense of the word. He sold a whole lot of nothing, mustered up some offense with headbutts and not so good looking punches. The crowd was into everything he did. And then he went over with the thumper. He actually had 2 of them here, delivering them on that thin hardwood canvas, which did not sound like it was fun to take bumps on. But that was pretty much all there was to it. Just a way to establish Dog as the main guy in town. And that took us back to Shreveport for the first card on this week's advertised event. The main event, actually. Skandar Akbar versus Buck Robley, with all of Devastation Inc. barred from ringside. What will now be a straight, clean match with no interference or shenanigans. I'm sure they took the heel's word for it. Well, the match itself was almost a complete afterthought considering what the actual finish was. They're going back and forth, trading some basic stuff for a few minutes. The action is mildly tame, considering how much stock they put behind the build to this on TV. And finally, after Robley catches Akbar in the sleeper hold, who should hit the ring? Not Kamala. My instincts were incorrect, as it turns out. It was interference from another giant behemoth of a man, the Mongolian Stomper. He catches Robley from behind and puts the boots to him. Ends up choking him out with that hangman sleeper on the ring apron. And Geeks tried to file to help him out, but they all got punked out in short fashion. And, that was rather disappointing. After devoting like 10 minutes to a lumberjack match between Robley and the one-man gang the previous week, all for the chance for Robley to finally get some ring time with Akbar, if he won. To think the actual in-ring confrontation went like 4 minutes before a fucked finish. That was it. That was the big payoff. I don't know. Probably could have given us a little more. Something bigger than the Mongolian Stomper interfering 5 minutes into a match. But, that was that. And then it's immediately back after the break for Kamala versus Tim Horner. Oh, by the way, I should note, it was not Kamala spelled Kamala, like Kamala Harris. No, it was Kamala, Kimala. Just like the video promo said, Kamala, 6'9". Kamala, 385 pounds. And also accompanied, Kamala was, by Friday, who became a staple of Kamala's gimmick during his career, even though the gimmick was worked by several different people over the years. I always forget who was under the Friday mask in Mid-South. A name will hit me at some point when I'm not thinking too hard. In any case, I'm sure most people know the Kamala gimmick well by now, so I won't bore you with the details there. This was the first TV appearance for him on Mid-South, so the face paint was a little modified here in '82. He still had the signature spear, the giant warrior mask for the entrance. They gave him the African war cry drum music. They definitely went out of their way to present Kamala uniquely from everybody else on the roster at the time. As a match, you pretty much got the prototypical Kamala Sugar Bear Harris style match. I mean, he was never a great worker in the sense of how a lot of people graded in today's business. He was a great worker in the traditional sense of working his gimmick to the fullest extent. As a pro wrestler, I mean, let's call it like it was. He was fucking rotten. Could barely hit the ropes without looking like a bull in a china shop. But we talked about this before. That was never really the appeal of Kamala, the wrestling skill or ability. Everybody sort of instinctually knew, the Jerry Lawlers, the Jerry Jarretts, the Bill Wattses of the world. They knew Harris was never a gifted athlete in the ring. Horrible body. But that's why the gimmick worked so well for him, because it was the perfect way to mask all of his drawbacks. You know, figuring they can milk something like this and get a lot of mileage out of it. They were able to keep this thing hot for years and years, while Kamala traveled from territory to territory under the same character. I mean, it really was genius in a lot of ways. And I mentioned that before. You know, right now it was just a Kamala showcase without anything related to Skandar Akbar. I'm thinking that'll get introduced later on once we sort of establish the affiliation with the group. Other than putting over Kamala in his debut match. That was all there was to it. The other thing I noted here was, lol, Tim Horner being the sacrificial lamb. Sucks to suck. He had that boo-boo job face on before the opening bell, which was hilarious. So coming back, we had the Grapplers in tag action against Vinny Romeo and Jesse Barr. I loved how Reeser Bowden couldn't just refer to them as the Grapplers. He had to methodically introduce them as the Grappler and his partner, Grappler number 2. Because it was ever so important that we establish their identities. Now, obviously, these guys are still beefing with Mr. Wrestling 2. So Watts made sure to cover that on commentary. Again, just a simple showcase squash to put the two heels over. Really nothing much else to add. They worked over the jobber's arms throughout the match so they could go over with the grappler twist. It was grassroots pro wrestling. As we then follow up with Mr. Olympia versus Rick Daniels. And as you can tell, I'm really flying by with things this week. It's really because there wasn't much to say with any of these matches. They were all simple but effective showcase squashes for the top stars they were trying to establish and get over. I believe Rick Daniels was Black Bart, if I'm not mistaken. Some really early footage of him from 82. And obviously this was before he went to Mid-Atlantic in 84. I remember that being the first time I ever heard them refer to him as Black Bart on TV. That's when he was teaming with Ron Bass before the big split later on. I could be wrong about that, though. Maybe he was wrestling under Black Bart a little earlier than that. Could have been 83. Because I know he was in Florida for a brief period beforehand. But Olympia ended up going over with a middle rope shotgun dropkick, which is really impressive to look at on slow-mo in the replay. But, yeah, again, that's all there was to that one. Nothing else to note. But then we got this epic Tony Atlas interview from Houston, where he proceeded to say the words Mid-South about 5,000 times in the course of a 15-second promo. I also enjoyed his comments here. He explains that he's not coming to Mid-South to shuck and jive, but he is, in fact, coming to Mid-South to get funky. Not funky like a monkey, but seems a bit contradictory if you ask me. Generally, it was a great, entertaining promo. Tony Atlas confirmed. He is Mid-South bound in 1982. Getting the call from JYD, his good friend. And we'll be seeing plenty more of Mr. USA Tony Atlas throughout the rest of 82. And most of 83, if I remember my timeline correctly. Another big name making his way into the territory. We also got some brief highlight footage of a 30-plus minute match he had in Mexico with El Gran Marcus, who I believe we've seen wrestle on World Class a handful of times. He was doing underneath matches on the prelims, but the name sounded familiar. And approaching the final minutes, they shot the angle where Marcus tried to stuff the gimmick in the mask, and when he went to headbutt Tony, it backfired on him, because Tony Atlas's head is made of steel. So Tony made the big comeback, hit a big flurry of drop kicks, and he went up top for a diving headbutt onto Marcus. Followed it up with a big running splash for the 3 count. And again, much like I talked about with Kamala earlier, Tony Atlas, not the greatest in-ring technician. He was an athlete, though, considering his agility and the fact that he could throw a few decent drop kicks and arm drags. That said, very limited in the ring in many ways. But when you're somebody that level of star power, you can supersede a lot of shortcomings. I mean, look at the body for one. He just screamed big star. So I'm looking forward to seeing Tony Atlas in Mid-South in the near future. Then we had Ted DiBiase versus Mike Bond, which, well, again, following the common thread with most of the TV squashes this week. Take a wild guess. If you said showcase match for DiBiase, congratulations. You figured out the formula for this week's Mid-South card. DiBiase beat him up for a while, went over with a power slam off the ropes, which then took us to the hot angle they closed the show out with this week. What was originally scheduled to be a Mr. Wrestling 2 squash turned into another impromptu hijacking segment, courtesy of Mr. DiBiase. Now, last week, he reminded us that he and Hacksaw Duggan held the show hostage and managed to successfully lay out Mr. Olympia. They also allegedly embarrassed and humiliated Dick Murdoch and JYD, which, well, I guess the tape would be able to confirm whether or not that was a lie. I seem to recall the opposite, where Duggan and DiBiase got jacked around like pinballs for 5 minutes. But maybe that's revisionist history on my end. In any case, DiBiase tells Wrestling 2, as he gets into the ring, that he would not mind giving him the same treatment this week, just to prove to everybody in the Mid-South region who the real top guy is. I mean, he is the North American Heavyweight Champion after all. So naturally, we get DiBiase and Wrestling 2 in an impromptu TV main event. And by the time they started this match, there was only about 5 minutes of airtime left. So you probably figured you weren't going to get a direct finish. Still, for the remaining time they had allotted, it was good. The Wrestling 2 worked over DiBiase. DiBiase sold great, bumped around for everything. Kind of similar to last week's TV angle with Duggan and DiBiase being human punching bags for like 5 minutes straight. And they're out there doing their thing. Bill Watts is frantically telling us that they're running out of television time this week. Still encouraging to say, fuck it, keep the cameras rolling. And we end up signing off with both guys in mid-brawl, which was not out of place for Mid-South TV main events a lot of the time, especially when we would have standby matches. A lot of matches would end very abruptly with time limit draws. But I did like how they closed out on a high note this week. Everything else up to that point was mostly just basic squash material. Didn't do anything to harm the show, but didn't leave us a whole lot of room for a thorough discussion. But here they at least use a TV angle to cover their tracks with the main event scene. You know, they sent out two top guys to have a big chaotic brawl, and it worked. The crowd was hot for it, so good stuff. You know, even if a lot of the show was mostly skippable, you had angles and segments in there that made it worthwhile. Again, you know who the top guys are. You know who's being prioritized. It was very match heavy this week, and that's fine. They still had enough to break up the flow and keep things interesting. A lot of new names showing up, putting over some of the big angles. None of the matches were too long, but they all got their point across. Very simple, effective episode of Mid-South TV this week. What was that, 41 minutes in runtime? Easy show to watch. 41 minutes. Felt like it went by in 10. And with that, we can move on to our final segment. This was indeed an episode of World Class Championship Wrestling. I guess you could call it the Stuff Happened edition of World Class Television. Basically, here's everything you need to know. They changed their main event to a tag match with Kevin Von Erich and Chris Adams versus Gino Hernandez and Jake Roberts. What was initially scheduled to be Kevin and Gino in a singles match. So for starters, I'll give them points for effort. They at least bothered to spice it up a little bit by throwing Jake and Chris Adams in there. Aside from that, there was virtually nothing else of note on the entire show, with the exception of one thing, which we'll talk about at the very end. But I got home late again on Tuesday night. My first thought was, am I going to have to sift through this in another 2 nights? Well, it turns out no. It was a straight shot from beginning to end. I watched the whole 42-minute episode with no pauses or breaks. And when it was over, aside from the final angle, really didn't get much else out of it. The opener for the card was George Weingroff versus El Diablo Grande. Yeah, that about sums that one up in short notice. El Diablo Grande. Never heard of him. Couldn't find a wiki page. Couldn't find jack shit about his background or if he wrestled anywhere else. I mean, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this gimmick was a Dallas exclusive. If he did wrestle in Mexico, I couldn't find any information on what territories Diablo would have worked for. The funny thing is, I just assumed they brought him in to do a job to Weingroff. Turns out it was the opposite. They actually put Diablo Grande over. Clean. And as a match, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. I didn't really pick up on the fact that Diablo Grande was supposed to be a heel until he started yanking on the guy's trunks during an abdominal stretch spot. Like the previous 4 minutes, they were just doing lucha spots, so I kind of assumed it was a babyface match. The finish was amusing, for my own sadistic pleasure purposes. So Grande ends up going over with a second rope seated splash. It was actually the whoopee cushion move that Doink used on Raw back in the mid-90s. Just take out the piped-in farting effects. What was great, though, is right as Grande is going for the pin, he turned around to try to hook the leg of Weingroff. Dude got a stiff handful of Weingroff's junk. He definitely caught the feel there before getting the pin. And you know what the best part was? Weingroff didn't sell it. What a trooper. But yeah, that was my main takeaway from that match. Diablo Grande wins via visible ball tap. At which point, we came back for a series of pre-taped interviews. And this is something I've actually noticed them doing a lot more of on recent tapings. You know, these quick locker room pre-tapes with all the top guys. I mean, we've seen a lot of frequent ringside interviews, but these on-site location pre-tapes, not so much. And I like them. Breaks up the flow a little bit, gets outside the main sportatorium room. In the first set here, we had Mark Lorenz interviewing Gino and Jake ahead of the main event. Of course, Jake is stoked that he finally gets the chance to get his hands on a Von Erich. He's been waiting for this golden opportunity since the day he came to Dallas. And for Gino, it's about more than just teaming with Jake Roberts and beating up some no-good stinky Von Erichs. He and Jake admittedly don't have a whole lot in common from a personality standpoint. Some may even say Roberts is a little, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But they both agreed that they can't stand the Von Erichs, and they would like nothing more than to win those six-man tag belts. That way Gino can place them next to his coveted Texas heavyweight and American heavyweight titles. Which, by the way, to this day, I don't think we've ever seen Gino come out on television with either belt in hand. For certain, I've never seen him carry out both titles at the same time. I know he just recently beat Mike on TV to regain the American heavyweight belt. But, yeah, he's been a paper champion for quite some time. I also love this, because while Gino is talking about Stella Mae French, he's trying to put over Nicole Roberts, a.k.a. Lady Giant, and she's trying to get herself in the frame here so her face can be shown on TV. And it's one of those goofy things where you clearly see her mouthing stuff on camera, but Lorenz is cautious enough to keep the microphone away from her. So it's like, I mean, she's definitely saying stuff. None of it is being picked up on the audio feed. But it's so obvious that she's not actually cutting a heel promo. She's like phasing in and out of words. She'll say a few things here, and then she'll start lip syncing some stuff. Gino's trying to cover up for it by continuing his promo. I just wonder, you know, if Baby Doll was that bad a promo in 1984, why didn't they just make her a mute? Why even bother letting her speak, period? Don't even bother. Just make her a China-type gimmick where she just stands there and looks menacing. Doesn't have to speak. Doesn't have to do promos. She can just stand there and look badass. I don't get it. There's a good promo from the boys. We also got a promo from Chris Adams. Different on-set location for this one. We were at Adams's quote-unquote office. And we had Bill Mercer conducting the interview here. And it was indeed a business office. He had a workstation. He had a desk. A phone. The good old classic telephone. More on that in just a second. And this actually went for like 3 or 4 minutes, and by the end of it, the gist of what I got out of Chris's promo was, I'm working my way up the ladder because I deserve to be at the top of the card. Which sounds like some entitlement bullshit right there. I deserve to be at the top of the card. Yeah, I've heard that one before. But no, all seriousness, that was Chris's entire promo. I'm with Gary Hart. He's my manager. Wherever he goes, I go. He dictates my future. He calls the shots. I've been on a winning streak under his leadership, so I'm sticking with it. That was kind of all there was to it. And again, if you have your radar on here, he had a very pompous attitude in terms of delivery. You kind of see where eventually that leads if you keep your eyes peeled. And the obvious takeaway here, aside from the promo, is while he was talking, Chris Adams' phone went off. There was a mysterious source on the other line who apparently wanted to talk business. And, well, we didn't get much info. Adams just said he would give him a call back. So the cliffhanger, who's on the other line? Is it Gary? Is it Kevin? Is it maybe Jake or Gino? Something smells fishy there. And it ain't Jake Roberts' locker. So from there, oh God, this match. I just now looked back at my notes and realized what was next. Buckle up for this one. Remember how I said there wasn't a whole lot to take away on this episode? Well, I lied. Because then we got this Tony Torres rock and roll Buck Zumhofe match. With the ultimate question being, will I finally, after all these weeks, pronounce Zumhofe correctly? The answer? Probably not. But it is apparently Zumhofe, not Zumhofe. It was, well, I was doing many a thing while this match was happening. If I told you I had it on in the background, that's probably being generous. At the point we were 30 seconds in, and I heard Bill Mercer joking about Tony Torres being a proponent of a guacamole, that is when I pretty much tapped out and figured, nothing of substance is going to happen in this match, is it? Well, that wasn't entirely true. But yeah, Bill Mercer blatantly attempting to find ways to humor himself. He knew this was a total nothing happening match. They took some turns working each other over in toe holds. There was a lot of laying around. I was bored to tears. I believe by the end, Lawrence timed the match at 8 minutes flat. It may as well have been 8 hours. And like I said, up until the final 2 minutes, everything they did was just boring. Couldn't even really call it bad. That was until the final 2 minutes occurred. And this thing totally fell off a cliff. And it began with Torres fucking up a basic shoulder block, where he was totally out of position to take the move. And Zumhofe had to throw out both of his arms to basically shove him to the ground. At which point, they do a spot about a minute later where Zumhofe is supposed to counter a headlock takeover into a head scissors. In all my years of watching wrestling, I don't think I've ever seen a guy willingly let go of a head scissors so that he can simply get to his feet and proceed to do a standoff. But that is what happened. I'm not shitting you. Zumhofe had Torres in a head scissors, and then he just let go. He broke the hold so he could then get to his feet and do nothing. To stand there. And of course, Torres gets back up to his feet and he looks at him like, so what the fuck was the plan? So they grabbed a hold. They continued to do stuff. They both visibly fucked up an Irish reverse spot in the corner. I don't even know what the hell happened here. Terrible miscommunication. Then they screwed up an arm drag takeover where Zumhofe did not lock Torres' arm correctly. So Torres almost came down right on top of his head. Zumhofe also whiffed a dropkick about 3 seconds after that. And finally, this cruddy train wreck ended when Zumhofe gave Torres a sunset flip for the pin. My final note reads, fucking putrid. In all caps. This was 6 minutes of dull action, followed by 2 minutes of some of the worst wrestling I think I've ever recapped on Dallas TV. And that takes into account every missing link and or Killer Khan match I've ever talked about. The last 2 minutes of this match was like first day in wrestling school terrible. Like literal first day training. Learning how to do a basic arm drag takeover. Shoulder blocks. They fucked that up here. Absolutely hideous. But after that, we were basically at the main event. No, not basically, we were at the main event. The most exciting and exhilarating main event, according to Mark Lorenz. Just totally spoiling the finish outright. He wasn't wrong, though. And let me just say this up front. You remove this main event with Gino and Jake versus Kevin and Chris, this would easily rank among one of the worst episodes of World Class we've ever recapped on this channel. The entire first half of the show was utter garbage for the most part. Discount some of the interview highlights. And then we got this main event. And this main event right here, this is the kind of stuff that World Class has been drastically needing for a very long time. Some honest-to-God, captivating story angles. I've talked about it for so long. They've been rotating around the same plane. And even with a lot of the main event storylines involving Gino and the Von Erichs, it's felt like a whole lot of stagnation for a long time. This, by far, was one of the better story angle payoffs we've seen out of World Class for pretty much the entire year. Maybe discount Kerry beating Flair for the world title at Texas Stadium, which was kind of its own separate entity. But as noted, the match is Kevin Von Erich and Chris Adams versus Jake Roberts and Gino Hernandez. I mean, part of me just wants to skip to the finish and talk about that because that was the main takeaway. But I do want to point this out. The previous 12 or so minutes where the boys were in there actually wrestling, this is almost a whole different level of what we're accustomed to seeing on these world-class television shows. Like, this actually came off like a main event quality match with real star power. For everything that Buck Zumhoff match was prior, this is the polar opposite. Everybody in this match was fantastic. Everyone's hitting on all cylinders. The people are into it. They were emotionally invested from start to finish. There was an excitement factor in the room that there hasn't been for a lot of these world-class TV main events for a long time. I completely neglected to talk about the angle right beforehand with Stella and Andrea. And we all know the Dallas faithful love their catfights at the Sportatorium. How often do we see those Sunshine Precious brawls for months and months and months? And the people always loved it. Well, naturally, before the opening bell, Stella immediately hits the ring and starts brawling with Andrea. And by that, I mostly mean they were hugging each other while rolling around on the ring mat for a while. The boys had to pretend like they were completely incapable of prying 215-pound women off of each other. Or, well, in the case of Lady Giant, probably more like 130. I'm half-heartedly joking. So that was a fun 3-minute sequence. We saw David Manning do this last time with the girls, but he immediately ejected Stella and Andrea, sent them to the locker room, since they couldn't be on their best behavior and be professional at ringside. So, well, the girls leave, and about 10 minutes later, Stella Mae French just meanders back out to ringside, and David Manning looks at her, and he does nothing. He scolds her. He goes, "What are you doing?" That was the extent of the punishment for Stella disobeying his orders. Well, in any case, they finally do the match. As noted, it's a great tag match. Everybody works so hard here. Gino and Jake in particular were really fantastic as a pairing. I believe it's the first time we've seen them team up together on World Class. Fuck, they may as well have been a functioning tag team in the territories for decades, considering how well they gelled together. I mean, Jake was a natural, that goes without saying. Gino could work with just about anybody, so that's also not shocking. And I'll just go ahead and cut to the finish, because, again, that was really the big takeaway here. They build to the spot where Adams tries to suplex Gino back into the ring, and they're very methodical with how they film this, as to not intentionally show the floor cam, and you'll see why in a second here. As Adams goes to suplex Gino, they stumble a little bit, and Gino actually ends up rolling through on Adams to score the pinfall, and it's one of those blink and you miss it instances where you're not really sure what happened. There's a lot of pandemonium happening, and then you catch the afterbirth, and you're like, well, that escalated quickly. What the hell happened? Because after the bell, Stella gets in the ring, tries to talk to Chris. Chris is flipping his lid, throwing a tantrum, and as Stella tries to calm him down, Chris does the unthinkable. He shoves this poor old woman to the ground, and he begins blaming Stella for what happened, claiming that she picked Chris's foot and tripped him up, which is obviously a blatant lie. But again, with them not actually showing the footage, we didn't really see Stella directly factored into the finish. It's not entirely disprovable. But, well, obviously Kevin didn't take too kindly to Chris shoving Stella down. So he gets confrontational with Chris and shoves him. And when Kevin turns around and sees Gary Hart in the ring next to Stella, he also catches that he's got a hand on her shoulder. And Kevin would not having that. So he cold cocks Gary in the jaw, drops him. And that's when Chris super kicks the shit out of Kevin, leaves him laying flat on his back. And of course, like a pack of wild dogs, Gino and Jake immediately hit the ring to start beating up Kevin. Chris and Gary Hart look on and do nothing to lift a finger to help. There's all this chaos ensuing. Cameras are running around trying to get a good angle of everything. People in the audience are screaming and throwing shit toward the ring out of disgust. It's a very heavy heat angle they're running with here. And of course, the dust finally settles when David Manning runs in with a chair, and Gino and Jake want no part of that. So they take a powder. And that's when the camera shows David explaining to Bronco and Lorenz what happened amidst all that chaos. And of course, you're seeing all this stuff in real time, and I mean, you're trying to process this and make sense of how we even got to this point. Was that the direct Chris Adams heel turn? Was he just pissed that Kevin put his hands on Gary? Was it a spur of the moment act? It's hard to tell. I mean, as I noted, they've been teasing the Chris Adams heel turn for a long time. The stuff with Gary Hart always seems suspect to me. And so we don't really know what the hidden agenda is there. I mean, we're still trying to rationalize if Gary's even a babyface at this point, or if the whole thing's been a facade since day one. Was all that business with Skandar Akbar a red herring to throw our senses off? It's great shit. They're leaving a lot on the table. People were up in arms about the finish, obviously. But it got over what it needed to. And now Chris Adams has a lot of explaining to do next time we see him on television. What led to this point? What was he thinking? Was this pre-planned? It was a hot close to the show and a very, very much needed heat angle. Again, I talk about the track record with World Class for a while. The shows have just hit a brick wall ever since the Texas Stadium event in May. They've been coasting for a long time. There are a few things of peak interest here and there, but in terms of like hot angles or big things to talk about, there really hasn't been much. Ever since the Freebird heel turn in '82. But now that the Freebirds are gone for a period of time, World Class has needed a change of pace in the main event scene. Devastation Inc.'s feud with the Von Erichs has been mostly hot garbage. And Killer Khan and Missing Link getting shoehorned into the main event week after week for the last 3 months. That's been a total disaster. Their matches suck. People don't care about them. It's not good television. But the Chris Adams heel turn, that was the exact move that needed to happen. I mean, he's been stale for a long time. The people I think were sort of ready for something new with him, even if they booed the heel turn, you could kind of tell that they were getting a little apathetic about the way he was being featured. And again, the Gary Hart stuff was always going to throw people off course anyway. So, this was a much-needed move. Places them in the perfect position to get the 6-man feud going with them and the Von Erichs. Gino, Jake, and Chris as a tag team. There are fresh matchups they can do with those parties. And that's the other thing that's been really lacking with World Class right now is all the fresh matchups they can do with the top guys. They've exhausted the Von Erich Devastation Inc. pairings. Jake Roberts and Chris Adams being the 2 new heels at the top of the card. Those guys are the perfect heat magnets for any combination of the Von Erichs. So they made a lot of progress in this one. All of a sudden, I'm not as sour on these World Class shows. Not that that's been the case entirely. I mean, I've enjoyed the World Class reviews by and large. But again, you've heard me talk about that the shows have just kind of existed for the longest time. They're very boring paint-by-numbers TV shows that do all the right things from a booking standpoint, but they don't really push the envelope in any way. You're not really left clamoring to see the next episode. That all changed here with one simple move. Flipping Chris Adams heel. And now we're looking at a whole different world of World Class here headed into the fall season and beyond. Thumbs up for that. Cool. All right. So that'll wrap up this Friday installment. Again, I appreciate you all coming back to check out the show. We will be back this Monday for, well, not the normal Monday podcast, as a matter of fact, because we got that WWE special to talk about, right? What the hell's the name of that show? Is it Fastlane? I keep forgetting. Yeah, so that's tomorrow, October 7th. So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and skip out on SmackDown this time. We'll do the NXT Classic Review Series. We'll do Retro Raw. I'll get those out of the way. And then we'll cover the Fastlane review for the Monday show. Hope people are not too gravely offended that I'm skipping out on SmackDown, but it is what it is. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care. Peace out.